St Giles Files. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the St Giles Files. So this week I'm going to pick up on where I left off last week, partly because I felt like I did a little bit of a disservice to the events that St Giles has held as I was listening back to it, and I thought I could do a little better with that. So what I decided to do was look into some work that Kira had done a little while ago before the lockdown, hence making use of Kira in the podcasts again. So whilst it might just be me speaking, she is involved in this one. She had been going through what are called the St Giles Chronicles. So they are a record of anything and everything that has happened in St Giles, newspaper clippings, orders of service, that type of thing. Well, exactly that type of thing, because that's what I'm going to be looking at. So I thought what I'd do is choose a 20-year period and look what was available in the Chronicles to give you an idea of what events had happened at St Giles. The caveat to this is that, as I've discussed in previous episodes of the podcast, it won't be necessarily a 100% accurate picture of what was happening in St Giles, because the things that have been saved will have been considered, I suppose, important at the time. They didn't just save everything and anything, unfortunately, and they've only kept the things I assume that they considered important. Although there have been some nice little things that I'll point out as I'm reading the list. But yeah, the caveat is that the list might seem overly grand without much of variation, I suppose, which I'll point out. So do just bear that in mind when you're listening to the list. So I decided to start in 1888. That's the first year of the Chronicles. And the first thing that Kira has documented for us is the ceremonial reception of old colours. So essentially this is old military colours were being hung in St Giles, which used to happen very frequently and has only happened, I think, once while I've been there, when a military body, whether it's a battalion or a regiment, is disbanded, they hang up the colours. Most of the time now, I think, in the War Memorial, but occasionally, very occasionally in St Giles. They all used to be hung up in St Giles. I'll post a picture of all the colours that used to be in St Giles on the website. But yeah, so there's in 1888 there is one of these services, and I'd expected to see these services there because they were reasonably frequent. But then Kira has documented about 10 other of these happening in fairly quick succession. And this picture that I'll put up shows you how many colours were in St Giles, almost to the point of bursting, I would say. If you're in St Giles, you can still see the small plaques on the pillars, and they show how many colours were there. And some of these plaques have been taken off at different points. So there are still tons of those plaques around, though, on the pillars, which will give you an idea. So that's one of the first things. Very atypical now, so a very typical event that has really fallen by the wayside. And interesting as well, touching on the Memorials podcast that I did a few weeks ago, there's an article from the time as well. As I was looking through our list that Kira put together, there's an article that she notes, which is from it's an article in the Christian Leader titled "The Scottish Valhalla." And it calls St Giles the Scottish Valhalla because it questions the propriety of, and this is a quote, placing symbols of war in the house that is devoted to the public worship of God. And it says there is happily a growing repugnance to the association of religion and war. So this was an article from the 22nd of November 1883, and I think it's an interesting take, because I suppose we could be easily forgiven for thinking that war was glorified at that point. You know, the British redcoats all across the world, and I think it's quite refreshing almost to see different things that are questioning that. Anyway, that was a bit of a divergence. A year previous to our 1888 ceremonial reception of colours, then, is on June the 21st, 1887, is the celebration of the Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And we know that because there is one of the orders of service in our Chronicles. And then coming on for 10 years later, in 1899, it's Victoria's 80th birthday, so there is a service for that. You'll get a bit of a feeling, especially going forward a little bit, that there is often a royal connection or a lot of royal services at this time, as there still is now, as I've mentioned in last week's podcast. And we often keep an order of service for those and other occasions. So Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1887, her 80th birthday in 1889, and then the funeral service for the Princess Royal Empress Queen Frederick in 1901. So a good few royal services back to back that we have there. And then in 1904, now this is a really interesting one, the 7th of March 1904. So I had read that, so I think the way Ciara had done it was, that she had made a note that Cameron Lees, who would have been the minister at the time, halts military services in St Giles, Ciara quotes, because he could not recognise the right of any other minister to hold a public service. He was responsible, he said, for all services held therein. And apparently tries to negotiate with the military to continue the services, providing they be placed under Cameron Lees, the minister's, control. And then just before that, it's noted that Sunday morning military services in St Giles officially come to an end and are transferred back to the Tolbooth Kirk. And that's the 20th of May, I think that was going to happen on. So I had originally thought it meant military services, like I mentioned at the first thing in the 1888 ceremonial reception of colours, but there actually must have been a military service every Sunday morning, which Cameron Lees didn't officiate at, and was rather frustrated that he didn't officiate at. Which you can imagine, if someone's preaching from your church, you might not want them necessarily saying things that you don't ascribe to, or not being able to know what they say. So you can imagine that, but it does appear that they didn't manage to continue the military services because they were ended. So that's two other interesting things, that possibly a bit of 1904 drama. And then this is one of my favourite things. In the December of that year, so in the December of 1904, we have the programme of weekly events and classes, including Savings Bank, which, if anyone knows what Savings Bank might be, let me know. And then what I really like this phrasing, gymnastic class for lads. And this speaks to a little bit of what I was talking about in the last podcast, that all different types of things were using, all different types of organisations were using St Giles for different things, the gymnastic class for lads and Savings Bank. And up until January, when we had some Tai Chi in the building, we hadn't necessarily had that type of thing in. So possibly, just to recap on last week, that we're getting back to what the building might have been like 100 years ago. And I think that's quite interesting, that I like that was kept as well, this programme of weekly events from 1904. That is a little bit of ephemera that I think is lovely that it's been kept, especially in the context that we've got all those royal services that I've just mentioned, and then we've got the weekly events, which includes Savings Bank and gymnastic class for lads. And then right after that, St Giles becomes involved in a bit of a historical debate, because in 1904 we have the quartercentenary of the birth of John Knox. Now, when I read that the note Ciara had made, it said 1905. So I was a bit confused. I was trying to work out what the quartercentenary could be, because obviously it wasn't 25 years since Knox had died. And then I assumed, well, the only other option then is 400 years. But then it wasn't 400 years, it was 390. So I did a bit of sleuthing around, and I will put a link to the article which shows me that apparently the service being held in 1905 raised the fact that the service was actually wrong in itself, and it was 10 years too early, so it should have been in 1915, but they held the service anyway. The 400th anniversary of John Knox's death was actually held in the 390th anniversary, and then pointed itself out as being wrong and raising the question in academia as to when he actually died. So I'll put a link to that article on, because it's quite interesting anyway. But that was what happened in 1905, so the quartercentenary of the birth of John Knox. And then a year later, very similarly linked to that, on the 21st of November, there is a record of an invitation to the official unveiling of the John Knox Memorial by the Right Honourable Lord Balfour of Burghley, who was also a member of the Thistle Chapel. This, I suppose, being very much a St Giles event. So whereas we've had St Giles hosting royal events, we've had St Giles hosting community events, this is very much St Giles hosting a St Giles event, and one to mark the 400th anniversary of John Knox's birth, with a statue which is the statue that you can still see in St Giles today. And then my final event to round off the 20-year period, which we've looked at there, is the service sheet for the unveiling of the memorial to the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. And this is the one that was placed above Haddo's Hole, which I'll try and find a photo of it. I'm not sure if we do have a photo of Haddo's Hole, but I think I can maybe find a photo and crop it down. Anyway, but this was the proof that Cameron Lees hadn't stopped all military services. It was just a specific Sunday morning one in 1904, and that we do actually get a memorial to the Royal Scots Fusiliers in 1908. So hopefully then that 20-year period that I have covered gives us a bit of an idea as to the different types and different uses of St Giles. As I mentioned at the top of that intro, then it probably gives us a slightly warped view in that all the royal services have been saved because they would have been considered significant, which we definitely consider them significant today as well. We'd be more likely to save a royal service indication rather than a pamphlet with the weekly events. But I think then we should be aware that these weekly events were happening. We just haven't done as good a job as saving the bits of paper that indicate that they were happening. So we get some royal events, we get some weekly events, we get some St Giles events, we get some military events, and we get some good gossip events from that time period. And I wanted to give you that time period to contrast it with our current time period. And then what I'll do to push the discussion out is actually it came out of a discussion I was having in our lockdown house as to how we memorialise events in different countries in our country. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, and hopefully I will do a reasonably good job of distancing it from the previous podcast on memorials, which I think I can manage, because the way I'm going to push it out to a St Giles and a modern context is to tell you a few services that have happened whilst I've been in St Giles, and services that, well, you might not expect to happen, you might expect to happen, but also I think things that, just to give you a flavour of the things that St Giles does and is used for, as I said, to try and put a bit more context to last week's episode. So one of the first services that I was a part of at St Giles was the Service of Reconciliation, and this was a multi-faith service, as many of the services are actually at St Giles. The Service of Reconciliation was a service which was held just after the Scottish vote on independence. And the idea was that regardless of the result, we would have this service and it would reconcile both sides of the referendum campaign in a spiritual gathering. The idea being to reconcile, I suppose. So that was the first service that I witnessed in St Giles that wasn't necessarily a St Giles event, was definitely a Scotland event. And then the next one was the memorial service for the victims of Srebrenica, the Bosnian genocide, which I was too young to remember, really. It was a really, I think, a powerful service to have, which there were services held in England, Scotland, Wales, I would guess Northern Ireland, although I don't actually know that. But it was a fantastic service because it was us remembering a different country's pain, I think, which was useful for me, especially because I had never really engaged in knowing about the Bosnian conflict, perhaps as well as I should have done. So it was really nice to, I think, bring that remembrance home to Scotland with this service. And it was a little bit of what we spoke about in our discussion in our lockdown house. So I'll bring that up again later on, I think. And then the next event that I will have been a part of every year, which is a really, really important one, I think, is every year we have a memorial service to the firefighter Ewan Williamson, who died very tragically in a firefighting in Edinburgh. And every year the members of the fire brigade come to remember him. And I think that's, again, St Giles being used not necessarily as St Giles Cathedral in a Presbyterian worship sense, more as the communal place of remembrance for Scotland, for Edinburgh maybe, and just somewhere to hold remembrance services of that nature that are important to Edinburgh and to Scotland. And then the final one then again speaks to that, but is a national one and is a military one. So it's the 75th anniversary of the RAF, which was in 2015. And again, is gives you a different flavour of what ceremonies St Giles holds and what national remembrances St Giles holds. So what I was aiming to do with those 4 services that I have witnessed is just give you a flavour of 4 different areas in which St Giles is used by the community. And off the back of that, I want to push it out then to the subject that I mentioned. How should society take note of traumatic events in our own countries and then in other countries? And so the way this was sparked for us was talking about the remembrance of September 11th in New York, and how, as a society, Britain remembers that event, and then how that's relatively talked about to other events. So the event we were discussing was the Rwandan genocide, how we don't do a brilliant job of remembering that and it being something we teach our kids about, but we do remember September the 11th in New York. Now, I won't get into why those things are, because I don't think it's for me to do, and I'm not even nearly qualified to do so. But that was our discussion. And I think what the point I'm making is that St Giles does a reasonably good job of representing different things and different memorials. And those 4 services that I mentioned that I've been a part of, we have one that is a very uniquely Scottish event, the Service of Reconciliation, one that remembers a foreign event in the memorial to Srebrenica, and then one that remembers a very local Edinburgh event for Ewan Williamson, and then one that remembers a UK event with the 75th anniversary of the RAF. And whilst we can do more to do that, to remember these events possibly that we don't remember, I think St Giles is doing quite a good job of remembering these things.
And I think at St Giles, even if we don't manage to have a big service for a memorial, well, we do a good job in another way when
the midday ministers will always remember events that have happened on that day, and actually have taught me quite a lot about events that have happened that I had no knowledge of that had happened on certain days. And if you listen into the midday service, which sometimes I do, you'll find out about these events and memorialising them, which is very important. And I think the other thing St Giles does is it plays a very important part and a central part in providing a space for spiritual remembrance in Scotland. And I say spiritual and not Christian because I think St Giles always tries to provide a spiritual place regardless of what religion or what belief system you are. Because there's many a service, and I remember one service where we had representatives from humanism, from Buddhism, from Judaism, from Islam at services, which then hopefully create a country representative spiritual event rather than it just being a Christian one. And I think the two marry quite nicely in that St Giles will always continue to be its Sunday services of Christian worship, but then it also does have to function as the centre of spiritual Scotland as well, I think.
And I suppose if we think about it, it always has been the centre of spiritual Scotland, which has hopefully become apparent from the events that I've listed off. It's just that our definition of spiritual Scotland is maybe being updated, and so St Giles will update with it and will still hopefully be the centre of spiritual Scotland, which I think it does quite a good job of. Right.
So yeah, that's maybe where I'll leave it today. I think possibly not as long as other podcasts, but it was partly to clear up some of the things that I'd said last week, which maybe hadn't been clear enough, but then also to bring out the idea of the functions that St Giles has, which I think probably did deserve a full podcast of its own.
And maybe give a nod to the fact that whilst the building might seem to be losing itself from a modern time, it's just a different way in which we use it. Right. Speak to you soon then. Bye.
The same postscript here as usual. As you can hear, I am still doing this on my own.
And we're still out of action and still longer than we all anticipated. And St Giles is still topping up the extra 20%
of our staff's furlough. But obviously we're still making no income from visitors whatsoever. So if you can help out and you have enjoyed the podcast, please do. Just head over to the website. It's really easy. There's loads of donate buttons everywhere. So it'd be much appreciated if you can help out. Okie doke, that's it then. Thanks, bye.